Jack, you know you've been talking about barbecues a lot.
Yes.
I don't know how you're going to feel about this. I had a veggie barbecue yesterday.
No.
My favourite thing, right? Tender stem broccoli, cooked on a barbecue, a little bit of oil, a little bit of chilli. Beautiful.
There is space on a barbecue for vegetables, but you have to balance it out with some steak or some burgers or some sausages. What have we been saying about the importance of barbecue demand and the meat market? Hi, welcome to Agonomics with David Udall.
That's me. And Jack Watts.
That's me.
We're both economists at AHDB, and I've been given this podcast series to help offer analysis of agricultural markets in a way that's a bit more user-friendly than simply numbers and graphs.
We're more meat pie than pie chart.
Red meat pie at that, as we cover beef, lamb and pork.
Dairy, cereals and oilseeds, and more besides.
So this week we're going to be looking at the behaviour at the tills. Given the latest inflation figures, we'll be finding out how consumers are really feeling.
And get a handle on what they are doing in store as we're joined by members of our retail and consumer insights team.
Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode.
New shows drop every Wednesday at midday, and please get in touch.
Comment on any of AHDB's social channels.
Or email us, agonomics@ahdb.org.uk. It's always good to hear from people both inside and outside of HDB, and it feels like we may be onto something with our agonomic shenanigans. You may remember last week we talked about the economics of sheep buildings and housing sheep during the lambing period. I had a very good exchange on direct message with an old friend of mine, Jo Franklin. You may well know her as the Lady Farmer on Twitter. And she was very much of the view that housing sheep has no part to play in the production cycle, and it's all about getting the right breed into the right farming system and letting nature play its role. I'm fairly sure that there are some other views on that, but an interesting take on what is quite a interesting bit of economic detail onto that subject. Thomas Vaughan from Basis posted about us on LinkedIn and says, economics has always been a guilty pleasure of mine, especially where it overlaps with geopolitics and population behaviours. This was a really interesting first episode. AHDB, thank you for this.
There is nothing to be guilty about, Mr. Vaughan, with economics. That is not a guilty pleasure. It's perfectly fine. And another agricultural economics legend that is Bob Bansback took the time to email and say that he really enjoyed our agonomics broadcast and it was a really effective approach to communication. So too did Tony Goodger from the Association of Independent Meat Suppliers, AIMS, who emailed to suggest that our listeners should be called levies, not aggies. So I still think we need some suggestions there. He also wanted more details of the lamb market that we featured last week. So everything is on our website there. Just Google AHDB lamb market outlook, you'll find it. And we've made it into, I think most importantly, we've made it into Sue and our IT department's podcast playlist. So I think at that point, we can probably just say we'll call it quits. Right. As ever, we have both been given a couple of mystery words or phrases that have no place in an agriculture/economics podcast, and we're going to have to slip into this episode somewhere. We'll reveal them at the end, but you see if you can guess them as we go along. This week they've been chosen by last week's guest, Izzy Shohet, which reminds us, if you haven't listened to it, do check out Izzy's guide to the latest lamb market outlook in our last podcast. So, shall we talk shop, quite literally? And I guess the first port of call, Jack, if we just dive straight in, probably is a bit of a talk about the inflation figures that were released last week, because that was quite interesting, quite a lot of detail beneath just the headline figures.
Anyone knows me knows that over the last 2 to 3 years, I've become quite obsessed with the inflation figures when they come out every month. No, it's not new data, but it's kind of come to its own, hasn't it, during the inflation crisis, whatever you want to call it, over the last few weeks, and sort of talking about consumer price inflation. Many would feel not a natural bedfellow. We're talking about agricultural economics, but actually really, really important part, particularly what we've gone through. So, and there's a couple of things to really bear in mind when anyone's interpreting the inflation figures, particularly at this point. The key thing is to say that the full story isn't just in the year-on-year figures. You have to look at sort of inflation over a period of years. What's that sort of baked in inflation? Last week, we had the numbers for May. So CPI came in at 2%. So basically nailed on the target set by the Bank of England. But if we look at that versus where we were in 2019, use 2019 because that's the kind of the typical last time life was normal. And so although year on year we were at 2% CPI versus 2019, we're actually at 24%. If we look at food year on year in May, 1.6%. That's really interesting because actually that's the first time in a long time that food inflation's actually been below overall CPI. And that's what it normally is, but for the last few years, food's actually been at quite a premium level of inflation overall. And since 2019, food has been is at 31%. So food in May 2024 was 31% higher than the average food price in 2019. Just to pick up some interesting categories within that. If we look at bread, 1.9% higher year on year, but versus 2019, 27% higher. If we look at whole milk, actually down year on year, 5.5%, but actually 32% higher against 2019. And meat, finally, 1.8% higher year on year. So again, below the overall CPI number, but actually up 29% versus 2019. And it's really important that we understand that because the key thing is not to get drawn in by his annual figures. If you're looking at those annual figures, say, well, the inflation thing's over, consumers, what's your problem? Back to normal. But actually figuring that actually a lot of these categories, the cost of food versus 2019 is actually nearly a third higher than it was before.
And then on top of that, obviously, you've then got to add in, just looking at food inflation there, but we look at all different types of inflation from energy markets and other products as well. And it makes a very challenging landscape from a consumer perspective, especially from the perspective of, disposable income and making the pounds and pennies stretch further. And this is probably a very good opportunity to welcome to our podcast Steve Evans from our retail and consumer team, who is probably the oracle with more information in this area to help us guide us through it. So welcome, Steve.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Jack, for having me on. I think the backdrop Jack was just taking us through there gives a really good indication for why we do what we do within the team. So our retail and consumer insight team essentially look at shopping behaviour and sort of behaviours that we see in the home and almost try and get to a little bit more about the whys behind the numbers as well.
So do we want to have a bit of an overview, I suppose, Steve, from your perspective, just in terms of where the consumer landscape is at the moment, kind of what you see the confidence levels like, and I suppose, is there a change in behaviour that we're seeing?
We are seeing a little bit more confidence come back into the market from consumers over the last 12 to 18 months. To Jack's point, it's still not as high as what we've seen in terms of confidence to where they were maybe in 2021. So over the last 2.5, 3 years, they've been faced with lots and lots of continued price rises in the category. And while we see some of those price rises ease off, we see a little bit more sentiment towards the high impact of prices in consumers' mindset. So we track continuously consumers' attitudes through a AHDB YouGov tracker, and we can monitor how sensitive consumers are to price. Over the last couple of years, it's been at the highest rates that we've recorded over the last 10 years. But we are starting to see that sort of ease back a little bit in the last 18 months. And what we start to see when increases go quite hard is consumers become very focused on good value for money. So it's that the quality is meeting their expectations. So it's not always that you go for the lowest priced item, because you could also, from a behavioural point of view, the food service market could also be impacted where you might not be eating out as much. So then suddenly you might be thinking, well, I'll eat at home. And you look at maybe a trade-in opportunity where you might be buying a higher priced premium product for that kind of treat element in home that would have actually been cheaper than some of the meals out that you might be consuming. So you kind of have to take that holistic look that sometimes you see growth in both premium and value ranges. But I think sort of over a longer period of time, we have seen that kind of continued pressure on that sort of mid-tier product, switching between sort of looking for good value products.
Is it right to think, though, that there are other factors that consumers might be reacting to in terms of to higher interest rates, higher mortgage repayments, higher gas bills, for instance? Do consumers then if they're feeling less well off, do consumers tend to then drive that into their buying habits on food as well? So are there kind of external factors to the food market that might influence consumer behaviour?
If you're taking it through a lens of just the consumer, then you have to say, well, they have lots of other factors to sort of consider, don't they, in terms of their own gas and electric prices, the sort of how much funds they want to spend on sort of holidays. And, you know, we've seen that over the last 2 or 3 years, the kind of term staycation kind of starting to come into common phrases from consumers about sort of like how much they'll actually spend on leisure holidays. You know, the propensity, even, you know, the housing market, sort of like what the performance is in there might have an impact then of like what sort of propensity or confident they feel about sort of moving or doing up houses. So it's not just an impact sort of in that kind of focused on the individual food behaviours. It's a lifestyle behaviours. And I think with that, you sort of also, the wider things we have to, or certainly we track within the team, is behaviours that are changing in that longer term picture. So, you know, in terms of lifestyles and behaviours, we're on the go a lot more than we were sort of like 20, 30 years ago. We're constantly looking for those kind of convenient options. I don't mean necessarily convenient ready meal type thing. I mean quick, snappy meals that people can cook for families or as couples, because often lifestyles and behaviours mean that they're actually trying to juggle lots of other sort of work and home commitments.
And I guess that's the thing that's interesting and kind of links this back, I suppose, to the supply base, and especially from a levy payer perspective of the supply base, from a farmer perspective, is that these are longer term trends. But these are the trends that are going to be impacting the requirements and the asks of their business as we go forwards. And so it's where it kind of comes into that forward planning. This isn't something that's going to be suddenly a game changer for their business tomorrow, but it does change, as you said, Steve, that structure of that supply chain going forwards. And another thing that I guess we've seen more recently, you know, over recent years, but kind of pre-COVID times as well, is that sort of consumer base who are actually reducing their consumption, and all of the different reasons why they're reducing their consumption. And over, is it a factor of cost? And we've seen that more recently, and you've explained that, but it's also other areas around health, environment, animal welfare, etc. They're important topics, and they're pretty important reputational topics for the industry, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of keep a close monitor of those. And certainly sort of like with the reaction of price, we've seen that shoot to the top. If you took the example of meat, in our latest data, it would have around 20% sort of looking at cutting back meat consumption. And cost is the main reason there. But once you move cost to one side and go beyond that, it's some of those wider reputational things like the health, environment, animal welfare. And they're kind of key areas where we can communicate sort of like the benefits and articulate how things are produced and the benefits of the end product to consumers. And I know through the work that we do with the AHDB marketing team, they're kind of key elements to the Let's Eat Balanced campaign. And it's a similar picture for dairy in the sense of these kind of reputational themes having a key impact. So cost isn't as necessarily as a score as highly when you look at it as reduces for the dairy, because it's not as high price point product as a meat based product, but it does feature there. But for dairy, it's still some of those wider reputational things like health and environment, less so animal welfare, but it's those key reputational landscape pieces that we know in the longer term we also have to keep our eye on, because typically what we've seen in the past, and we are starting to see it come through now, is that when cost starts to ease back in terms of on top of mind for consumers, we start to see these kind of wider reputational factors like health, environment, and welfare almost come a little bit more to the forefront. So in the kind of tracking data we've got, it's not that these factors have gone away in any way, it's just that price has bubbled to the top. But we also know when that bubbling eases, that those wider reputational pieces are still key communication bits for consumers.
I suppose focusing on communication there, we've actually got a pretty important webinar coming up, haven't we, which is going to be released tomorrow, Thursday 27th is when the webinar is. Do you want to give a bit of an overview of what's included in that and what to expect?
So shameless plug time. It is our our newest mid-year webinar. So we've typically done these annually. We switched it online during COVID and it's worked really well for strong engagement. So you can sign up via the Retail and Consumer Insight web pages on the AHDB website. What I would also say is if you're pressed for time or you love to play and listen back on catch up, then sign up anyway, because you can get a link to the recording. I'll be hosting the session. We've got Grace Randall, who's our lead Retail Insight Manager, presenting on it, and we've also got Tom Price, who's analyst in our team, and we've also got Carrie from our HDB marketing team, who will be looking at how we use some of this retail and consumer insight into that kind of end marketing to consumers.
Great, thanks, Steve. That sounds like a paroxysm of information we're going to get from that webinar later this week. But next up, we are indeed going to be talking about seasonal events with Grace Randall from the team. So Jack will again get to berate me about my courgette choices on a barbecue. But first, here's some more up-to-date news from the markets.
If you're in the market for another podcast to subscribe to, then look no further than our Manager's Special, AHDB's Food and Farming podcast. Recent episodes include a consumer insight offering on red meat labels and supermarket aisles, as well as a dairy special about our work with retailers to promote milk. If you're after herbs, or rather herbal lays, our shelves are stacked with sage advice on how to introduce lucerne and clover into your fields. In fact, we cater for all tastes, so you'll find sections dedicated to all sectors: pork, cereals and oilseeds, dairy and beef and lamb. And don't forget our middle aisle, where you can often pick up a bargain episodes you didn't know you needed to listen to. Search Food and Farming wherever you get your podcasts. AHDB thanks you for your custom.
Hi, I'm Olivia Bonser, Senior Analyst at HDB, with a look at grain and oilseed markets for the week commencing the 6th of January. Despite some support in wheat markets over the Christmas period, prices have been under pressure in the new year from a strengthening US dollar, technical selling and sluggish global demand. However, Russian wheat crop conditions remain in focus, with warmer than usual temperatures and excess moisture in key growing regions. Persistent hot and dry weather in Argentina is also raising concern over the country's maize crop, which is now in its critical development stage. For rapeseed, new crop prices are supported, with doubts over prospects for global rapeseed production in 2025, though forecasts of heavy soybean supplies from South America limit any major price increases. Over the next few weeks, weather in major exporting countries such as South America and Russia will be key in driving prices. The USDA will also release updated global supply and demand estimates at the end of this week. To stay up to date with the latest data and analysis across arable, red meat and dairy markets, head to hdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
You're listening to Agonomics with David and Jack.
I'm David Judall.
And I'm Jack Watts.
And earlier on, we were talking to Steve Evans about consumer world, and we're now going to move on and talk about seasonal events and welcome Grace Randall to the podcast. So Grace, seasonal events, barbecue season at its height. Now the weather is finally created some blue skies and the rain has moved away. We were talking about sort of the demand side earlier. How important are these kind of seasonal events to the demand side for our red meat sectors and dairy sectors?
Thanks, David. Yes, I'm Grace Randall, Lead Retail Insight Manager in the team. We're really excited to be releasing a new report this week on looking at key seasonal events. They are really important to our categories from both the demand perspective, but also from the supply side. We wrote a report back in 2019 looking at how important these events are. But with this new report, we're really hoping to bring together both sides of those markets so that we can show how important they are to our levy payers.
So how important is it then, Grace, for these markets going into this barbecue season? How significant is this for the demand side for our sectors?
So summer is a tricky one because it really does depend on the weather. So 2023 was a complete washout. So we did see a lot of our categories under index over the summer, unfortunately, just because we didn't have that weather. So fingers crossed for that peak in demand that we do usually see in a normal summer, where we see people going out and buying those barbecue foods. It's also important to remember, though, that sometimes summer can be too hot. So going back to 2019, we saw when we were in that massive heat wave that actually no one wanted to be doing a barbecue when it was 40 degrees. No one wants to stand over a fire cooking their food when it's that warm. So just getting that right balance is really important. So summer is a bit of a tricky one. And what we do see is that Christmas is by far the most important occasion for consumers. It's the one that they are most relating to. It's the one that they are looking forward the most to celebrating. And we do see that all of our categories over-index at Christmas. So for beef, for lamb, for pork, and also for dairy, we see significant uplifts in demand in that 2 weeks on the run-up to Christmas.
Grace, we all like to think that the presence of an international football tournament drives demand. Is that true, or is the weather more of an important factor?
I think the weather is more of an important factor, but it definitely helps. Adding the good weather alongside those sporting occasions, we do see uplifts. I think also in the out-of-home market as well, we see people going out and watching those things in pubs, in bars. So we see uplifts in alcohol, but we also see uplifts in food as well.
And thinking about those seasonal events, like longer term, are we seeing any changes in the trend of what people are consuming? Like you mentioned Christmas there, for instance. We've seen for a few years that the classic turkey has been moving slightly lower in its consumption. Are we seeing any change throughout the year for any of those other seasonal events in terms of, is there a change in trend of what people are going for?
We've seen this happen recently at Easter. So we saw a lot of the lamb sales coming through on promotion, and that sort of come through from Christmas as well. So we really saw a high level of promotion at Christmas. We've seen a lot of the retailers moving away from that everyday low price strategy into getting those consumers into their stores through those promotional deals, and in particularly loyalty pricing as well. So really what the retailers are promoting is what is being picked up and bought by consumers.
And we saw that earlier in the year, Jack. We spoke about it many times, haven't we, around lamb and the offers of lamb around that Easter time, and especially, as Grace was saying, pretty much from Christmas. But I suppose the question I've got, Jack, really around this is, we see that changing demand side domestically. And as Steve was talking about earlier on, in terms of people aiming for different cuts of meat as their priorities change and their spending patterns change, that must have a direct impact upon the carcass balance and therefore the overall efficiency of that carcass, the price of it, and therefore where we can be trading that to. Because the other balance of this, if anything we're not consuming domestically, would have to go on the export market.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important. So at the farm level, I think it's sometimes easy to forget about the importance of carcass balance. But if you're a meat processor, it's one of the things that's going to keep you awake at night, because that's the thing that helps you deliver the value. It's constantly evolving. We've seen, I guess, through COVID and then through the cost of living crisis, that demand. Let's talk about beef for a moment, I suppose, that you kind of got that elevated mince demand, and that's kind of supporting carcass balance a bit. But I think that longer term trend, as Grace was talking about, was that lack of appetite for those kind of traditional roasting occasions gives a real problem for how do you then find the value for those elements of the carcass. And there's always the bits of the carcass that necessarily domestic consumers aren't all that interested in, but are valued around the world. So it's really, really important to find a market for every part of the carcass. I think a former colleague always used to say we're trying to sell everything apart from the squeak when we're talking about from a pig point of view.
So I suppose, Grace, just to round it up, is there anything sort of specific that we should be looking out for? You've mentioned that eventing report is coming out now. Is there any other resources or anything that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, we've got loads of content that's going out regularly on our website. So I do encourage you to go and look for things like that. And we do have more research coming up, which we'll be publishing. So we've just done some research on the halal market. So that will be coming out from our team in the next few months. But then we're also trying lots of other different formats as well. So we've been recently doing some YouTube videos. So I'd encourage you to go and look at the AHDB YouTube channel for some short clips on there as well about consumer demand.
Thank you. As ever, we're not only shining a light on the insight that we produce, but also the volume of what we do. So thank you for listening, everyone. Don't forget to check out the webinar, which is released tomorrow. We'll link to it, the registration. And as ever, there's more information on our website, ahdb.org.uk, for all of the detail that we discuss on this podcast and more, and the opportunity to subscribe. We've got new episodes of Agonomics with David and Jack every Wednesday at midday. And as we said at the start, don't forget to get in touch with us. You can email us at agonomics@ahdb.org.uk or comment on any of the AHDB social channels. And I've got a question for you, Jack. How obvious was it that I dropped my mystery word in there? Was it a giveaway?
It was. My biggest problem is I'm struggling to be able to pronounce it. So and I'm glad you got that mystery word and not me.
I indeed had to Google it, Jack. Paroxysm. There was a couple of different pronunciations of it. So I hope I got it right, and I hope I used it in the right context. And I'm going to say thank you, and I'm also going to say I'm not saying thank you for Izzy for last week for choosing that word for me. But I genuinely didn't get yours, Jack. I honestly didn't get it.
So I went early on mine, just ahead of Steve's section, and mine was bedfellows.
How did you get bedfellows and I got paroxysm? What?
I think I got lucky there, definitely with that one. I listening to yours, I thought that sounds like something you go to the hairdresser to have, but clearly something that I'm not very au fait with. So there we go.
I'm having words with Izzy when I see her in the office next.